Hello and welcome to a new motorcycle video recording. It's Wednesday the 25th of May and I'm about to take a ride on a motorcycle. What happens here is I just click the camera onto the left hand mirror of my bike and I get on the bike and I go off riding. I don't have any particular destination where I'm going. I don't have any particular route. I just go riding and go around the countryside. And my aim here is to show you a little bit of the countryside around Launceston in Tasmania, and at the same time talk about things that interest me. I don't have a script that I work from. I just talk about whatever it is that interests me, and hopefully it interests you. In this case, I'm going to talk about the recent Australian election and how our electoral system works. Not necessarily the result and whether who had good policies and who didn't have good policies, but only just try and explain to you how I understand the electoral system works. So if you're interested in that and want to know more about it, then by all means stay tuned. If not, then turn the volume down and just enjoy the scenery. So straight into the electoral, explaining the electoral system to you. On Saturday the 21st of March, the Australian public, or the Australian voting public, went to the polls to choose a new government. Elections are held, constitutionally required to be held every parliamentary election, I should say, because we have a parliamentary system in Australia based on the Westminster model, but not exactly the same. The parliamentary elections are required to be held every 3 years according to the Constitution, but in actual practice they are often held more frequently than that, because when an election is held or not held is at the whim of the Prime Minister. So if the Prime Minister is feeling particularly confident and thinks he can win another, or she for that matter thinks they can win another election, they go to the Governor-General and say we need an election, and the Governor-General agrees and an election is held. Most of the states of Australia now have parliamentary terms that last 4 years, and in New South Wales at least the 4-year term is fixed. So the elections are held, I think, on the second Saturday in March, and so everybody knows when the election is, and it's a bit like the American system when the presidential election is held, everyone knows when that is. In our case, elections are held on Saturday, so that everybody gets a chance to vote, even those people who work, and polling places are open from 8 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night. Now, to explain a parliamentary system, we have in our Commonwealth Parliament 2 houses of Parliament. One is called the House of Representatives, or the lower house, or the People's House it is sometimes referred to as, because people get to choose individuals to represent them. Those individuals represent what we call electorates in Australia, what in America are called districts, I think, and what in the UK are called constituencies. But so people get to choose a person to represent their electorate. We also have a Senate. In the lower house there are currently 151 members, and in the Senate is what's known as the States House, because when Australia became a federation in 1901, the idea was that the existing colonies would join together and become one country, and in order for that to happen, all the states had to be guaranteed that their rights would be protected. So each state has 12 senators, which are currently elected for a 6-year term, and every 3 years half of them face an election. So the parliamentary system means that the party that gets the most number of its members elected in the lower house or in the House of Representatives gets to form the government, and the person who is the head of that party or the leader of that party gets to become the Prime Minister. So in the previous Parliament, the Liberal National Party and the Liberal Party and the National Party between them had 76 seats. The Liberal Party had the most number of those seats. I think it must have been 66, and the National Party had 10 seats. So the leader of the Liberal Party, Scott Morrison, gets to become the Prime Minister. The leader of the National Party, Barnaby Joyce, gets to become the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, Anthony Albanese has become the Prime Minister because although at the moment he doesn't have 76 seats, he has 75, which is more than any other group any other group has, and any of the other groups going together still wouldn't necessarily have more than he has. So he gets to govern and become the Prime Minister in what at the moment is a minority government, meaning that on occasion he will have to negotiate with what are called the crossbenchers or the independents, in order to get his legislation, in order to get his program through the parliament. Now, as I said earlier, elections are held on Saturdays and they are free and compulsory. By compulsory, what I mean is everyone has to vote. People over the age of 18 are required to put their name on the electoral roll. In fact, when you turn 17 and a half, I think, if you think there's going to be an election shortly, you can put your name on the electoral roll in anticipation of turning 18 before the election is held. And what you do on the appointed day, Saturday the 21st of May in this case, is you go to the polling place, you go to a desk and you give a person your name and address, and they find your name and address in the electoral roll, which is the list of everybody in Australia that's enrolled to vote. And they ask you, have you voted in an election beforehand? And you say, if you say no, they give you some ballot papers. They cross your name off the list and they give you some ballot papers. Now, the compulsory part of the voting is that you must turn up to the polling place and have your name marked off. What you do with the ballot papers is your own choice. If you decide to number them correctly, your vote will count. If you decide not to fill them in correctly and number all the squares or whatever the instructions say, you will have voted, but your vote will be called an informal vote because it hasn't completed all the requirements and it won't be counted. And if you don't mark the papers and you just put them in the ballot box, or you write something stupid on there, then obviously your vote doesn't count. Compulsory voting did not come in until 1924. Australia became a federation in 1901, so those first few elections were held without compulsory voting, and even when voting became compulsory, in some states women weren't allowed to vote, and of course the First Nations people, or the Indigenous people of Australia, were not allowed to vote until the 1960s. So even though it is compulsory voting, not everyone was required or able to vote. Now, in a parliamentary system, in the system we have in Australia, there are, as I said, areas, districts, constituencies, or electorates as we call them. And the Constitution and the electoral acts that govern the conducting of elections say that electorates should be of approximately the same size in terms of the number of voters that are in them. Not geographically the same size, but approximately the same size in terms of the number of voters. We have a body called the Australian Electoral Commission, which is part of the administrative branch of the government, the public service, if you like, whose job is to administer the elections, to print the ballot papers, to keep them secure, to hire the halls and all those sort of things, but also to look at the demographics of the country. We have a population of about 25 million and I think about 17 million registered voters. When they look at the demographics, they look to see if there's been a shift in population in a particular area sufficient to warrant either creating a new electorate or abolishing an existing one. And in the period between the last election in 2019 and this one, it became obvious that it was necessary to do what's called a redistribution, that is a redrawing of the electoral maps and distributing the population according to those electorates, because in Western Australia there'd been a shift of population and one electorate was abolished, but at the same time there'd been an increase in the population in Victoria, so a new electorate was created in Victoria. So the total number of electorates wasn't changed, but just where they were was changed. And that is, as I say, conducted by the Australian Electoral Office, and it's called a redistribution. The political parties may be consulted with the maps and shown this is the map we've drawn, and they may have some input into it, but the final decision is made by the Australian Electoral Commission. Now, come election time, there are some criteria that you must fulfil before you can stand as a candidate for election. Number one criteria is you must be an Australian citizen, and you cannot be a citizen of another country at the same time. In the last parliament, we had a number of people who were disqualified by the High Court, which is our highest court and equivalent of the American Supreme Court, that because the Constitution says you cannot have an entitlement of any sort to another country. So if your parents or your grandparents were Italian or English or French or German or whatever it is, and you might therefore be able to gain some benefit like a pension or citizenship or something like that, you had to renounce that. So you cannot hold dual citizenship and be a member of Parliament. You also cannot be bankrupt, because obviously if you are elected to Parliament and you have debts and somebody offered to pay off those debts for you, your vote would be basically bought and you would be able to be influenced. And you also cannot be elected to Parliament if you've been convicted of a crime that carries a sentence of more than 1 year in prison. So if you fulfil all those requirements and your name goes on the ballot paper, when you go to vote, you're given two papers. One is to vote for the House of Representatives and the other is to vote for the Senate. We have preferential voting in Australia, which means that you have to, in the House of Representatives, if there are 5 candidates on your ballot paper for the House of Representatives, you must number 1 to 5. If there are 10, you must number 1 to 10 and so on. In the Senate, you must number at least 12 squares for your vote to count. Now in Australia, because we have a parliamentary system, we do not vote directly for the Prime Minister. The only people who get to vote for the Prime Minister are the people who live in the electorate of the person who is the leader of the party that forms the government, and he becomes the Prime Minister. If we were to vote for the Prime Minister, we'd have a presidential style system like they do in America, and we probably don't think that's a good idea. So what you do is you go into the polling place and you go into a little secret booth and you number your squares 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever it is. And how the preferential voting works is this. At the end of the polling day, the people start counting the votes. They count all of the votes for every candidate who got the every candidate's number 1 vote. Then the person who got the least number of number 1 votes is eliminated from the count, and all of their votes then go to other candidates according to how they've been distributed on their ballot paper. And they keep on doing that until they've exhausted all the preferences of all the candidates and one person has been declared the winner. In the United Kingdom, for example, they don't have preferential voting. They have what's called first past the post voting. So once a person has got 50.1% of the votes, they're declared elected, because the other person could, obviously, all the other candidates together could only have got 49.9% of the votes. We have this preferential voting, and it's exhaustive preferential voting, which means that sometimes the result is not always known on the night, and sometimes the result could be open to challenge by somebody saying, well, I want these votes recounted. I want to check and make sure that all the preferences were distributed properly, and so on. So once that counting is all done, and the makeup of the House is then known, the party with the biggest number of its members elected becomes the government. Now, as I said, if one party can't do it on their own, they might go into a coalition, as the Liberal Party do with the National Party, and form government. In this case, the Australian Labor Party has decided not to go into coalition, but they've said they would negotiate with what are called the crossbenchers, or the independent members, when it comes to particular pieces of legislation. Now, in Australia, we do not have an impeachment process. There's no way, you cannot impeach the Prime Minister and have the Prime Minister removed. You can have the Prime Minister removed, that's not, but we don't have an impeachment process. Now, if you followed Australian politics at all, you'd know that, say, between about 2007, when Kevin Rudd became the Prime Minister, and either late 2018 or 2019, early 2019, when Scott Morrison became the Prime Minister, we went through about 7 Prime Ministers. The party that is in government has the right at any point, for any reason, to decide that the person who is the leader of the government, therefore the Prime Minister, is no longer up to doing the job. Whatever reason, they don't have to give a reason. They can just say, well, we decided he or she is not up to doing the job, and that person can be removed by that party. Doing so doesn't change the government, it changes the Prime Minister. And so we had Kevin Rudd, and then Julia Gillard, and then Kevin Rudd again, and then we had Tony Abbott, and then Malcolm Turnbull, and then Scott Morrison, with the parties each deciding the person that's leading the party, or is the Prime Minister, is not up to the job, they need to go. There are ways to change the government other than an election, and they are fairly complicated, but in essence they come down to 2 things. Under a parliamentary system, the Prime Minister and his or her government must maintain and always have the confidence of the House. That is the lower house, the People's House, the House of Representatives. So at any time, if the members of the House feel that they don't have confidence in the government or in the Prime Minister, they can move a motion of no confidence in the government, and if there are sufficient numbers of people who support that and that motion is passed, the convention is that the Prime Minister would resign. Now, you try to imagine a situation where in a 151 member House, 76 members belong to your party. So the likelihood of a no confidence motion passing against you is fairly slim. But if you were in a minority government, such as is at the case at the moment with the Australian Labor Party only having 75 members, there are 76 members on the other side. Some of those are Liberal Party members, some of those are National Party members, some of those are independents, and some of those belong to the Greens. Now, if at some point they decided that the government was not performing to their liking and they all got together and decided this government's got to go and they passed a vote of no confidence, then the Prime Minister would have to resign and he would have to go to the Governor-General and say, I've just lost a vote of no confidence in the House and therefore I resign my commission. The Governor-General will then call on the leader of the next biggest party, in this case it would be the Liberal Party, and whoever the leader of the Liberal Party is at the time, it's anticipated that it'll be Peter Dutton, and say to him, well, look, this is the situation. You know that the vote of no confidence has been held. The government's lost that vote. I'm going to give you a period of time to see if you can form a government. And if you can, then I'll require you to get a vote of confidence from the House. If that happens, you'll continue to be in government. If you get a vote of no confidence, then an election will be held. The other way a government can be removed is if those same parties in the lower house decide that they will no longer pass money bills. The government must always have what's called supply, that is money to spend. Now you think, well, I pay my taxes, that they just spend it. That's not entirely true. The High Court says that before the government can spend any of your money, they must pass a bill authorising the spending of that money. And the government calls those bills appropriation bills. So they appropriate money from the Treasury or wherever they store it and say we're going to spend it on this particular thing, whatever that is. If the lower house will decide we're not going to approve of that appropriation bill, and again remembering 76 members of the lower house belong to your party, you've got to get all the other people on side and agree to that. But if they did agree to it and you as the government had no money, then you couldn't pay wages, you couldn't pay parliamentarians, you couldn't pay your public servants, you couldn't spend money on any of the programs that money is currently spent on by a government, and you would therefore cease to be a government. Now this video is about to run out, so I hope that's given you some explanation of how this all works.